I had been in my dream home for less than a week when the HOA showed up to take a piece of it away. Not a misplaced fence or an unapproved mailbox, but the very heart of the property, my private lake. They didn't ask, they demanded I sign over the deed, claiming a century-old clerical error made my paradise their rightful property. They saw a newcomer they could steamroll, a problem they could crush with fines and legal threats before I had even finished unpacking. They believed they held all the power. But they made one colossal mistake. They never bothered to read the fine print on their own community charter. What was their mistake? They had no idea their entire neighborhood was built around a secret I now owned. To understand how I ended up in a legal war over a body of water, you have to understand what that water meant to me. For 15 years I worked a job I didn't love. I lived in a cramped apartment where my only view was a brick wall, and the only nature I saw was a stubborn weed growing through a crack in the pavement. Every single paycheck, a portion of my earnings went into an account I nicknamed the Escape Fund. My dream wasn't complicated. I didn't want a mansion or a fleet of fancy cars. I just wanted a small house with a piece of land and some water. A place where I could hear birds instead of sirens, a place where I could feel the earth under my feet instead of concrete. The search took 2 years. I looked at dozens of properties, but none of them felt right. Some were too close to the highway, others had neighbors who lived practically on top of you. Then, one rainy Tuesday, my realtor called with a sense of urgency in her voice. An estate sale had just listed a property that hadn't been on the market in over 60 years. It was in a community called Oakwood Landing, and it had, in her words, a unique feature. That feature was a 5-acre, spring-fed lake. When I saw it for the first time, even with the gray sky overhead, it took my breath away. The house itself was modest, a simple 2-bedroom that needed some work. But the land and the lake, that was the masterpiece. The water was crystal clear, and the property line extended a full 50 feet past the shoreline on all sides. It was entirely, unequivocally private. This was it. This was the escape. This was worth every single soul-crushing spreadsheet and pointless meeting I had ever endured. I drained my entire escape fund and signed the papers. The first week was pure bliss. I spent my days unpacking, painting walls, and rediscovering the simple joy of physical labor. My mornings started with a cup of coffee on the small wooden porch overlooking the water, watching the mist rise from the lake as the sun came up. In the evenings, I'd walk the perimeter of my property, a slow, satisfying patrol of a kingdom I had worked half my life to acquire. The peace was absolute. The community of Oakwood Landing seemed perfect, almost suspiciously so. The lawns were all perfectly manicured, the houses were all painted in a muted, approved palette of earth tones, and everyone waved as they drove by. It was the picture of suburban tranquility. On the third day, I received my official welcome packet from the Homeowners Association. It was a thick, binder-style folder left on my doorstep. Inside was a welcome letter from the HOA president, a man named Richard Harrington, alongside a list of community events and, most notably, a rulebook that was nearly 2 inches thick. I laughed as I flipped through it. There were regulations on everything from the acceptable height of grass to the specific type of solar panels you were allowed to install. It seemed excessive, but I figured it was just the price of admission for living in such a pristine neighborhood. I tossed it on a counter to read later and went back to my work, completely unbothered. I started to notice Richard Harrington after that. He was an older man who seemed to have made patrolling the neighborhood his full-time, unpaid job. I'd see his golf cart cruising slowly down the street at all hours, his eyes scanning every home, sometimes stopping to make a note on a clipboard he always carried. He gave off an air of someone who had been given a thimbleful of power and had mistaken it for an ocean. He waved at me once or twice, but his smile never quite reached his eyes. It was the look of a king surveying his subjects, checking for any signs of dissent. Still, I thought little of it. I was a quiet person who kept to myself. I followed the rules. I was no threat. What Richard didn't know was that I'm a meticulous researcher by nature. Before I put in the offer, I spent weeks at the county records office, digging through deeds, surveys, and zoning maps going back 100 years. My main goal was to ensure there were no hidden easements or claims on the lake. I needed to be absolutely certain that my private paradise was truly private. The ownership was ironclad. But during that deep dive, I had stumbled upon something peculiar. The original charter for the Oakwood Landing community, drafted in the 1950s, had a very specific clause about the community docks. The docks were located on a small sliver of land bordering my property, the only community access point to the much larger public reservoir miles away. The clause tied the dock access rights not to the HOA, but to the ownership of the plot of land my house now sat on, the one with the private lake. At the time, I had dismissed it as a historical oddity, a piece of outdated legal language that the modern HOA had likely superseded with their own bylaws. The founders probably made a deal with the original farmer who owned my land to secure water access for the community. It seemed like a trivial piece of forgotten history. I made a copy of the document, filed it away with the rest of my paperwork, and didn't give it a second thought. My focus was on securing the lake, and I had done that. I was safe. That final morning, before my world was turned upside down, was perhaps the most beautiful of all. The sun was brilliant, the air was crisp, and the lake was a perfect mirror of the sky. I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, feeling a sense of profound contentment. I had done it. I had escaped. I had found my peace. As I took a sip, I saw Richard Harrington's golf cart parked at the edge of his own property, a few houses down. He was just sitting there watching my house, watching my lake. I felt a small, cold knot tighten in my stomach, a primal sense of being watched by a predator. I dismissed it as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling. An hour later, he was on my porch, holding a certified letter, with that same smug grin on his face. The war had begun. The letter in my hand felt heavier than paper ought to be. It was crafted with a kind of smirking, corporate aggression, filled with pseudo-legal phrases like historical community asset, erroneous deed filing, and reclamation protocol. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that the lake I had just purchased was, and always had been, the property of the Oakwood Landing HOA. It cited a dozen obscure bylaws from their 2-inch thick rulebook, each one twisted to support their impossible claim. They gave me 14 days to sign over the deed voluntarily, to avoid what they called costly and unavoidable legal proceedings. It was a declaration of war, dressed up as a bureaucratic notice. My first reaction wasn't fear, but a hot, white flash of indignation. I had done my due diligence. My deed was legally sound, my property survey was professionally certified. This was absurd. Believing in the power of reason and evidence, I drafted a polite but firm response. I made it clear that their claim was baseless, and I attached pristine copies of my deed, the official county survey map highlighting my property lines, and the title insurance policy. I stated my hope that this was all a simple misunderstanding and that I considered the matter closed. I sent it via certified mail, creating a paper trail just in case. For a few days, a tense silence fell over the neighborhood. I thought my logical, fact-based response had worked. I believed that, when faced with undeniable legal proof, they would have no choice but to back down. I was wrong. They weren't interested in facts or laws. They were interested in power, and they were just getting started. The first fine arrived a week later. It was a crisp, white envelope with the HOA's embossed logo, looking official and menacing. The violation? My mailbox was painted unapproved gloss black, a shade apparently too shiny for their standards. It was a $100 fine. This was the mailbox that had been here for years, the one that came with the house. I paid it, telling myself it was easier than fighting. A few days later, another envelope arrived. $200. My grass was, according to their meticulously cited measurements, a quarter of an inch taller than the community maximum of 3 inches. I had mowed 2 days prior. I paid it again, but the feeling of frustration was beginning to curdle into real anger. The attack on my lake had failed, so now they were trying to bleed me dry with 1,000 paper cuts. The fines became a weekly occurrence, each one more ridiculous than the last. There was a $50 penalty for improperly stored recreational equipment, when I left a garden hose coiled by the spigot overnight. There was a $150 fine for non-native vegetation, because of a patch of wildflowers that grew naturally near the water's edge. Richard Harrington's golf cart was now a permanent fixture at the edge of my property line. He'd sit there for hours, clipboard in hand, just watching and waiting for the slightest infraction. The friendly waves from neighbors had ceased entirely. Now, I only received cold stares or people who would pointedly look away as I drove past. Richard wasn't just harassing me, he was turning the entire community against me, painting me as a villain who was defying their perfect suburban order. My dream home was rapidly becoming a hostile territory. I felt isolated, a prisoner on my own land. But the bureaucratic harassment was only the second wave of their attack. The third was far more insidious. It started one Saturday afternoon. I was inside, trying to ignore the constant feeling of being watched, when I saw 2 teenagers walking down my lawn, fishing rods in hand, heading straight for my lake. I went outside and calmly informed them that this was private property. They just shrugged. One of them said, "Mr. Harrington told us the lake belongs to everyone now. He said we could fish here whenever." It was a deliberate escalation, a direct physical encroachment. Richard was using children as pawns to violate my property, daring me to become the angry man yelling at kids. I escorted them off my land, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and anxiety. Where would this end? The answer came the following week. I woke up to the sound of hammers pounding into the earth. I looked out my window and saw two men in bright yellow vests, hammering stakes with orange flags into my lawn. They were surveyors and they were marking a new line, one that sliced right across my property just a few yards from the edge of the lake. Richard was there, of course, standing with his arms crossed, watching the whole spectacle from his golf cart. This was pure psychological warfare. They were creating a visual representation of their claim, a daily reminder that they were coming for my land. The orange flags felt like an invading army's banners, planted defiantly in my soil. The peace I had cherished was completely shattered. My sanctuary had become a battleground, and the sight of my own home now filled me with dread instead of joy. I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. I consulted a lawyer who confirmed what I already knew. My ownership of the lake was legally indisputable. He said we could fight the fines and file harassment charges, but he warned me that HOA disputes were notoriously long, messy, and incredibly expensive. He said the HOA could use community funds to drag this out for years, while I would have to pay out of my own pocket. It was a war of attrition and Richard knew it. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through my dark house, looking out at the lake shimmering under the moonlight, the orange flags standing like silent, mocking sentinels along its shore. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, a cold weight pressing down on me. Was I going to lose my dream not to a legal ruling but to a slow, painful financial bleed? The final blow came in the form of another certified letter. It wasn't a fine. It was a special assessment levy. The HOA's board, led by Richard, had voted to formally hire a high-powered law firm to expedite the reclamation of the Oakwood Landing Lake. And they had levied the entire projected legal cost, a staggering $50,000, directly and solely against my property. They claimed that since my unwillingness to cooperate was the reason for the legal action, I alone was responsible for the cost. It was a financial checkmate. They were forcing me to pay for their own lawyers to sue me. My savings, the last of my escape fund, would be wiped out. I would be forced to sell the very home I was fighting for just to pay the bill. They had me cornered. For a full day I was paralyzed by despair. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the assessment letter, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. I had followed the rules. I had the law on my side. But it didn't matter. Richard Harrington was a tyrant who had turned the full weight of the community against me, and he was going to win. But as the sun began to set, despair slowly began to burn away, leaving behind something else, a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to surrender. I had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to be bullied out of my home by this petty dictator. If they were going to ruin me, I was going to go down fighting. That night, fueled by a surge of defiant energy, I tore through my files. I pulled out every piece of paper related to the house. The deed, the survey, the title insurance, every fine, every letter. I was looking for anything, any small detail I might have missed. Then, my fingers brushed against a forgotten folder. Inside was the document I had copied from the county records office months ago, the one I had dismissed as a historical curiosity. It was the original founding charter for the Oakwood Landing development from 1957. My eyes scanned the old, typewritten pages, the legal language dense and archaic. And then I saw it. The clause. I read it once, then twice, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. It was clearer than I remembered. It stated that as a condition for the original zoning approval, the developer had entered into a permanent, unbreakable covenant with the owner of my specific plot of land. In exchange for the farmer allowing the development to be built, the charter granted the owner of Plot 7A, my plot, sole and absolute administrative control over the community docks, their maintenance and all access rights in perpetuity. It was a foundational clause of the entire community, a condition that could not be amended or superseded by any future HOA bylaw. A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't just a defense. It was a weapon. All this time, Richard had been attacking me, trying to steal my lake, believing I was just some isolated homeowner he could crush. He had no idea. His entire community, his little kingdom, depended on those docks for their access to the public reservoir, for boating, for fishing, for their property values. And he had just spent a month trying to destroy the one person who held the key to it all. He thought he had me in checkmate. He was about to find out he was playing checkers, and I was about to flip the entire board. The notice for the annual HOA meeting felt like a summons for my own execution. It was mandatory for all homeowners, and I knew exactly what Richard had planned. He was going to use that public forum to humiliate me, to cement my status as the neighborhood villain, and to publicly justify the financially crippling assessment he had levied against me. A month ago, the thought of walking into that room would have filled me with a paralyzing dread. But now, holding the crisp, yellowed copy of the 1957 Town Charter, I felt no fear. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my stomach for weeks had been replaced by a block of ice. I was no longer the prey. That night, I wasn't walking into an ambush, I was walking in to set a trap. I spent the afternoon preparing. I made 50 copies of the Charter's signature page and the crucial clause regarding Plot 7A and the community docs. I highlighted the key phrases in bright yellow so they were impossible to miss. I didn't hire a lawyer to accompany me. This was something I had to do myself. This wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a personal reckoning. I put on a simple, dark suit, a kind of armor for the battle to come. As I walked out of my house that evening, I took a long look at my lake. The orange survey flags were still there, mocking me from the shoreline. I smiled. They were monuments to an arrogance that was about to be shattered into a million pieces. The community clubhouse was buzzing with the low murmur of self-righteous chatter. As I walked in, a hush fell over the room. Every single head turned to face me. I could feel the weight of their collective judgment, the whispers, the glares, the pointed way people turned their backs to me. They saw the man who was trying to steal their community asset, the selfish outsider who was costing them all money. I saw a room full of sheep, led by a wolf who had convinced them I was the threat. I ignored them all, took a seat in the back row and waited. Richard Harrington was in his element. He stood at the podium at the front of the room, basking in the spotlight, a smug monarch addressing his court. He went through the mundane business of the meeting, the budget, the landscaping committee report, with an air of forced patience, clearly eager to get to the main event. Finally, he cleared his throat, and a predatory glint appeared in his eyes. "And now," he announced, his voice booming with false gravitas, "we must address the unfortunate matter of the Oakwood Landing Lake." He launched into a 10-minute monologue, a masterful performance of lies and half-truths. He painted me as an unreasonable and hostile resident who had laid an illegitimate claim on a beloved community feature enjoyed for generations. He waved a copy of the $50,000 assessment, calling it a necessary measure to protect the assets of our community from selfish interests. He never used my name. I was only the resident of Plot 7A, a tactic designed to dehumanize me, to turn me into a problem to be solved rather than a person to be heard. The room was with him, nodding along, their expressions hardening with every word he spoke. He was stoking their anger, directing it at me, and I just sat there, my face a mask of calm, letting him build the pyre higher and higher. This was the peak of his power, the moment of my deepest public humiliation. He was judge, jury, and executioner, and he was savoring every second of it. When he finally finished his speech, he looked directly at me, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. "The board has concluded its presentation. Does the resident of Plot 7A have anything to say before we vote on further legal action?" This was it. The entire room was silent, all eyes on me. They expected me to beg, to argue, to protest my innocence. I stood up, walked slowly to the front of the room, and stood at the podium next to a suddenly nervous-looking Richard. I placed my stack of copied documents on the lectern. I didn't look at him. I looked at the crowd. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the silent room. "I'm not here tonight to talk about my lake. My ownership of that lake is a settled legal matter, confirmed by the county and insured by my title. Arguing about it further is a waste of time and, as you've just heard, a waste of a lot of your money." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard's smile tightened. "No," I continued, "I'm here to talk about something far more important to this community. I'm here to talk about the docks." A wave of confusion rippled through the room. The docks were the pride of Oakwood Landing. They were the community's gateway to the large public reservoir, the launch point for boats and kayaks, the place where families gathered in the summer. They were, in many ways, the single most valuable asset the HOA managed. "I've been doing some reading," I said, picking up one of the copied documents. "I've been reading the founding charter of this entire community. Most of you have probably never seen it, but it contains some very interesting language. Specifically, a covenant tied to the original zoning grant from 1957. I held up the paper. "I'll read it for you. Be it enacted that the right to administer, maintain, control, and grant or refuse access to the community dock facilities shall be vested in perpetuity to the legal title holder of Plot 7A. I let the words hang in the air. The silence was no longer hostile, it was stunned. I scanned the faces of the board members sitting next to Richard. Their confident smirks had vanished, replaced by pale, slack-jawed disbelief. I then turned my head slowly and looked directly at Richard for the first time. His face had gone from ruddy and triumphant to a sickly, ashen gray. For those of you who may not be familiar with the official plot designations, I said, my voice dripping with cold precision, I am the legal title holder of Plot 7A. Which means, according to the unalterable founding document of this entire neighborhood, I control the docks. The HOA has been operating them illegally for the past 60 years. Every fee you've collected, every rule you've enforced, it's all been a fraud. A chaotic explosion of noise erupted from the crowd. I held up a hand and surprisingly they fell silent. Therefore, I said, my voice rising with newfound power, here is what is going to happen. Effective immediately, I am assuming my legal administrative control. And my first act is to close the docks. They are closed to all residents indefinitely. The panic in the room was now palpable. Angry, frightened voices started shouting all at once. I continued, speaking over them. They will remain closed until a full legal and structural audit has been completed at my discretion. And they will not reopen until the following conditions have been met. I paused, letting them absorb the shock. 1. The $50,000 special assessment against my property is rescinded. Immediately. And publicly. 2. Every single fine that has been levied against me in the past month is to be refunded in full, with interest. 3. I will receive a formal written apology from this board for the campaign of targeted harassment I have endured. I looked around the room at the faces that had been so filled with hate just minutes before. Now they were filled with panic. They weren't looking at me as the villain anymore. They were all turning their furious eyes on one person, Richard Harrington. They realized his personal vendetta was about to cost them their summer, their recreation, and a significant chunk of their property values. I picked up my remaining copies of the charter and placed them on the front of the podium. I've brought copies for everyone. I suggest you all read it very carefully. And with that, I turned and walked away from the podium. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't entertain a single question. I walked down the center aisle through the stunned, chaotic crowd, the sound of their shouting and arguing rising into a furious roar behind me. I pushed open the clubhouse doors and stepped out into the cool, quiet night. The war for my lake was over. The battle for their docks had just begun. The walk home from the clubhouse was the calmest I had felt in over a month. The air was cool, the stars were out, and the furious shouts echoing from the building behind me were like a distant, fading storm. I had dropped a bomb made of paper and ink into the middle of Richard Harrington's little kingdom, and now all I had to do was wait for the fallout. I didn't have to wait long. My phone started buzzing before I even reached my front door. It was a board member, one of the men who had been sitting next to Richard, looking so smug just an hour before. His voice was no longer arrogant. It was a high-pitched, panicked squeak. I let it go to voicemail. 2 more calls came in from different numbers, both board members, both of which I ignored. They could stew in the mess they had created. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, without the familiar weight of anxiety pressing on my chest. The next morning, the orange survey flags were gone. I noticed it the moment I stepped onto my porch with my coffee. Someone, likely a frantic HOA board member, had come in the dead of night and pulled every single one of them from my lawn. It was a silent, desperate offering of truce, a white flag raised before the negotiations had even begun. An email was waiting for me, a formal request for an emergency meeting from the HOA's vice president. The tone was completely different from their previous communications. Words like misunderstanding, regrettable oversight, and seeking an amicable resolution had replaced the aggressive legal threats. They had clearly consulted their lawyers, who had undoubtedly confirmed the terrible ironclad truth of the founding charter. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. I made them wait for 2 days. I let the pressure build. I knew that every hour the docks remained closed, with a heavy chain and a new padlock I had personally installed, the fury of the residents would be redirected from me to Richard and his board. He had promised them a lake and was instead costing them their reservoir. When I finally agreed to the meeting, I set the terms. It would be held in a neutral location, a conference room at a local library, and the HOA's entire legal counsel was to be present. I, in turn, would be representing myself. Walking into that conference room felt like a victory lap. The entire board was there, including a haggard and defeated-looking Richard Harrington. He wouldn't make eye contact with me. He had aged 10 years in 2 days. Their team of expensive lawyers sat opposite me, their faces grim. They knew they had no case. The lead counsel began by offering a weak, jargon-filled apology for the procedural errors that had occurred. I held up a hand and cut him off. "There will be no more legal jargon," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to accept your unconditional surrender." I laid a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a document I had drafted myself, outlining my terms exactly as I had stated them at the meeting: the immediate and public rescinding of the assessment, the full refund of all fines, and a formal written apology for the campaign of harassment. The final point on the document was a new one: the immediate resignation of Richard Harrington as HOA president and from the board entirely. Richard's head snapped up, his face flushing with a final, pathetic flicker of defiance. But before he could speak, the board's lawyer put a hand on his arm and pushed a pen in front of him. The other board members were all staring at him, their expressions a mixture of fury and desperation. He was a liability they could no longer afford. Defeated, he signed the resignation letter they had clearly prepared beforehand. One by one, the rest of the board signed my agreement. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. Within a week, everything changed. A check for the full amount of the fines I had paid was delivered to my house by a sheepish-looking board member. An official letter of apology, printed on the HOA's letterhead, arrived in the mail. And at an emergency town hall, the board publicly announced that the assessment against Plot 7A had been a grave error based on incomplete historical documents, and was officially null and void. Richard Harrington was not there. A rumor circulated that his house was being quietly put up for sale. His reign was over, ending not with a bang, but with the scratch of a pen in a sterile library conference room. The docks remained closed for another month. During that time, I had them professionally inspected. The inspection revealed years of neglect. Several of the support pylons were rotting, and the electrical wiring for the lighting was dangerously frayed. The HOA, under Richard's leadership, had been collecting fees for maintenance that was never done. I used the detailed inspection report to draft a new dock access agreement. It was a simple 2-page document that transferred full operational control back to a newly elected HOA board, on the condition that they adhere to a strict, transparent maintenance schedule funded by a reasonable, independently audited resident fee. It also contained a clause stating that any legal action taken by the HOA against the owner of Plot 7A would result in the immediate and permanent revocation of the agreement. It was a check on their power, a permanent shield forged from their own past aggression. I signed it, the new HOA president signed it, and the next day the locks came off the docks. Life in Oakwood Landing settled into a new kind of normal. The cold stares and whispers from neighbors were replaced by something that felt like a mixture of awe and a healthy dose of fear. I became a local legend, the quiet man who had single-handedly dismantled a corrupt HOA with a 60-year-old piece of paper. People I'd never spoken to would now give me a wide, respectful berth and a quick, nervous nod. I didn't want their friendship, but I welcomed their respect. The oppressive atmosphere of constant surveillance vanished. The new HOA board, terrified of repeating the mistakes of the past, became far more focused on genuine community maintenance than on petty rule enforcement. The neighborhood actually became a better place to live. My peace returned, deeper and more profound than before. My mornings were once again spent on my porch, overlooking my lake. But the view was different now. The water wasn't just a feature of my property, it was a symbol of what I had fought for. It was a reminder that true ownership isn't just about a deed or a title. It's about the right to be left alone, the right to the quiet enjoyment of what you have earned. The whole ordeal had taught me a valuable lesson. It taught me that bullies, whether they are on a playground or on an HOA board, thrive on the assumption that you won't fight back, that you don't know your rights, and that you'll be too intimidated to look for the fine print. They rely on you not knowing the rules of the game they are playing. They stormed onto my property thinking they could use the weight of a community to crush an individual. They saw a quiet newcomer and mistook my desire for peace as a weakness they could exploit. But they made one colossal, fatal error. They forced me to dig through the history of this place, to unearth a secret that had been buried for decades. In their obsessive quest to take my lake, they ended up handing me the keys to their kingdom. They never got a single drop of my water, but in the end I had to decide whether to let them have access to theirs. And what do you think is the ultimate form of power? Is it wielding your authority like a weapon, or is it having the authority and choosing not to wield it at all?